Hey everybody, welcome back. This is How to Tableau. I'm Luke Stanke. In this video, we're talking about the if statement. This is actually our second video on the if statement. In our first, we really broke down the basics of it. If you haven't watched the video yet, I highly recommend you go back and watch it before watching this one. In this video, in part 2, I've got 6 more tips for you where we're going to discuss how to improve performance of your calculations, your if statements, and then how to work with the if statement in aggregations. That's it. Those are the 2 main topics. Let's get started with this episode. Let's start with our first tip of this second episode. This is actually tip number 8. In tip number 8, I want to discuss when you're going to use the if-else statement or else statement or the case statement. And it really comes in handy in the example you'll see here. We have all the states on a map, but what I want to show is their abbreviations. And if I'm going to create that calculation, what I end up having to do is say if that state is equal to the state name, in this case Alabama, then I want to show AL. If the state name is equal to Alaska, if I can type, if it is equal to Alaska, then I want to show AK, the abbreviation for Alaska. I would have to continue to write all of these out until the very end. I'd have to write out, right? And I'd type out state is equal to Minnesota, which is MN. That's a lot of writing out the same statement over and over and over and over and over and over. I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want to have a more repetitive process or a less repetitive process that basically says state is equal to every single time, because I'm always going to put down state is equal to. And that's where the case statement can be very useful. And if you've only ever used Excel, you've probably never seen the case statement. So let's just take a look. I've actually already saved ourselves some work by creating a state abbreviation calculation. And if we look at it, I'm going to use the case statement. And all I say on the first line is case state. And case state is like saying if state is equal to, and then each subsequent line, and you don't have to put these on separate lines, but I do it here, is I say when Alabama, then that label, when Alaska, then that abbreviation, all the way through every state and the Washington, D.C. Covers off every single possible label. And you'll notice at the end, I also can use an else statement. Just like with my if statement, my case statement can have else's that kind of cover off all the additional values. I'm putting in null here. And again, like if statements, if I have null values and I don't want to specify the null values with the else, I don't even need to put it in. So there we have it. I'll hit OK. And now I have state abbreviation. I can just click and drag this value right over state and release, and you'll now see the labels. And when I take a look at the northeast of the United States, all those overlapping labels are now gone, and I'm seeing those individual state abbreviations a lot clearer. That is tip number 8. All right, we did tip 8. Tip 9 actually revisits the visualization we put together in tip 7. It's this bar on bar chart that shows the goals. Do you remember how we created those goal calculations? If you don't, let's just take a look at that calculation really quickly. That calculation, when we put it together, looks a bit like this. We specified the region and the year and then provided a number and sort of this percentage above that number for the next year's goal. That's what we did. We used 2018 data to create these 2019 sales targets. And when we built this calculation, we actually did it the right way. There is a right way and a wrong way, and the right way is to use else, if, and statements. So in our if statement, we specified both the region and the year, and then we provided the value, and then we used this else if statement and another and statement, and then specified the value. So this is the correct way to create these calculations using else, if, and the and statement. And we did this for every 2018 year. But you might be thinking, what if I just said, let's specify the year first, and then we'll do a nested if statement? And that's how I started doing my calculations when I was new to Tableau. And it looked a little bit like this. My else if statement was now with that space of separating out a second statement, an if within an if statement. If we look at it, we specify 2018, and then we say, okay, once we have 2018, let's then do the calculations for each region. This will give us the same correct answer of values. However, the big difference here is in the nested if. The issue with a nested if is if you have a large data set, you're creating an extra calculation that is ultimately going to slow down the performance of your dashboard. So if you're designing for speed, don't use the else if statement where you have a nested if. Use the single else if value in order to create your calculation. That is tip number 9. Tip number 10. All I want to do is go back to the calculation we used to create our sales targets for 2019 using 2018 data. And when we created this target, we just arbitrarily started with Central region first. It was the first that showed up on our visualization. So we wrote down Central and we created the target for it. And then we chose East, and then we chose South, and then we chose West. Again, just because that's the order it came out in. There was no thought, rhyme, or reason to this. Well, when you're starting to try to optimize, you can actually be a lot more thoughtful about the placement of those values. And how you want to place these values is really simple. You want to cover as much data in your early if statements than the next value. In this case, if we take a look at the underlying data, if I just move this calculation out of the way, I can actually show you where the calculations are happening the most. Where do I have the most data? Well, it's in the West region. So I should actually start out my if statement with West. And then if I sort of just reorder this so that we can take a better look at it, is that we should actually start by using West and then doing East and then doing Central and ending on South. So I'm just going to reorder my values here. I'm going to move West, Control, cut and paste this value up at the top. And then I think East is next. So I actually can just move Central down. I'm just going to, again, copy and paste those values out. So we'll just say else if, paste that value out, and Central, South, and then I can just get rid of this last statement. And now I've reordered those values. This data set's pretty small, so we're not going to notice any changes in performance. But as I get a larger and larger data set, by reordering those values to be in a position where larger parts of the data are affected earlier on in the if statement is going to improve performance. So if you've got like 90% of your data happening in one if statement, put it up early. If you kind of have just like this tiny use case in your data for one thing that might be happening, put it later on in your statements. And that's tip number 11, or actually that's tip number 10. And let's go to the next tip. Earlier on in the previous episode, we talked about the importance of the if statement. I really want to show it here. I always find myself inserting an if statement into an aggregate. So instead of showing total sales like you see on this chart, what I want to show is the percent of sales that are of the home office. And I can do that by nesting an if statement inside of a calculation. So I'm just going to go and create a new calculated field, and we're going to call it percent of sales conditional on home office. And in this calculation, I'm going to start with sum, and I'm going to nest an if statement inside of sum, but then I'm going to divide it by the sum of sales as well. And what you'll end up with is a percentage here because we're going to put an if statement here. So we're going to say if segment is equal to, let's try that again, is equal to home office, then let's show sales. And we don't care about the other values because they're going to be null, and we'll just say end. So this is what we're going to create. We're going to just get home office sales in the numerator, and in the denominator, the value after the divisor, we are going to see total sales. And this is going to give us the percent of sales for home office. So now I can just take this calculation and drag it and replace on rows sales, and I will have the percent of total for that each month for home office. And it's just that easy. And we just inserted it in an aggregate. And you should find ways to insert your if statements in any calculation. That's the way to do it. Don't put things on filters. It's just not worth it. Just better. The only reason you need to put something on filters is if you're going to have something that you're going to have is like a dynamic filter that's available to your end user. Otherwise, everything, if statements, put them inside aggregates. It's the best way to go. Trust me. All right. We are at the penultimate tip. It is inserting the if statement into table calculations. You're going to do it once in a while. I want to show you and make sure you're doing it the right way. Both ways, totally possible. One way you're going to use a lot more than the other, and I want you to focus on using just this one way. Don't do it the other way. Don't listen to anyone who's going to tell you how to do it the other way. It's just not right. What we're going to do is I've got two charts made already. They're going to look identical, but they operate in a completely different way. So the first one is this table calculation where we have an if statement, and it's a nested if statement where the segment is equal to home office. Then let's get the running sum of sales. So this right here is just a running total of home office sales across the entire data set by month. We can actually do that calculation two different ways. Just like on the second option, you will see the exact same calculation. And when we put them side by side, table calculation number 1 and table calculation number 2, they both look identical. So what do these calculations actually look like? Well, let's take a look. In table calc number 1, we created our calculation, or at least I created my calculation to look like this. I basically said if the attribute of segment to create an aggregate with the attribute function, if that attribute is home office, then give me the running sum of sales. This is how a lot of novice Tableau users use table calculations and use if statements. And frankly, this is really the wrong way to use an if statement in this case. You will find yourself in very rare cases having an acceptable way where you are embedding a table calculation inside the if statement in a format similar to this. The real way that you should be doing it is in table calc number 2. In table calc number 2, we are following an approach that is very, very similar to the way that we set up the calculation in tip number 11. In tip 11, we nested our if statement inside an aggregate. In this case, we nested it inside the sum of sales. And then from there, we placed our table calculation around that calculation, which gave us, in this case, or gives us, in this case, the running sum of sales for home office. Both look the exact same, but I've set it up so that it does look the same. And our biggest issue will occur when we pull segment off of our marks. And as soon as we do that, you'll notice calculation 1 broke down. It's because we no longer have segment on our view, which is not allowing attribute to find home office. ATTR of segment is going to be just a star in this case, which is going to break our calculation. But if we set it up the way we do it in table calculation number 2, where we have the nested value inside the aggregate before the table calculation, we're always going to return our value as expected. That is tip number 12, our penultimate, second to last tip. And for our last tip, I just want to show you how to use an if statement inside an aggregate inside a level of detail calculation, because there are 2 different ways you could think about it. And I've created one level of detail calculation for us to think about this with. I'm just going to make a little more space here, and let's make this a little bit bigger. In my first example, I actually have it commented out, so it's actually going to be our second example. But for the active calculation right now, we're fixing by region. So we're going to say for every region in our data, let's do some aggregation. And we're going to, again, use home office as our example. So only when we have home office, let's get the sum of sales. Well, if we take a look at what happens in this calculation, we actually have this on our view. We know that home office sales are greater than 0, but our calculation is actually not returning the correct value. And that's, of course, because I have min here, and you're like, Luke, you should use attribute, ATTR. And when I do, guess what? Tableau doesn't like this function inside of LOD, so you can't use it. So in fact, no matter how I do this calculation, well, I can get it with the max value. And the reason max value works is because home office is the max value alphabetically in segment. It doesn't work with min. And really, if we weren't using this one example, it'd really be a roll of the dice of whether it was going to work or not. So if I were to change this value to corporate, it's never going to work because it's the middle value. It's never the min or the max. It's always sort of stuck in between. So this example, this first way, or this way that's currently active on our view, is the wrong way to do it. The way you want to do it is the way that we sort of set it up earlier in step number 11 when we inserted the if statement into the aggregate. In this case, for this second example, the correct way to do it, we are taking a fixed region. So for every region, let's get the sum of home office sales. This is the correct way to do it. We nest our if statements inside of aggregates. We do not put aggregates inside of ifs. Just doesn't work. That's how Tableau was designed. It's designed to do aggregations last, and if we put them in the middle of something, we're slowing down the performance, especially when we're using an if statement. So that's my last tip. Let's just roll through them really quickly. So there you have it. That's it. Those are the 6 tips for part 2. Tips 8 through 13. Tip number 8, we discussed the case statement, gave you good recommendations for when to use it. Tip number 9, we discussed not nesting if statements, instead using else if. In tip number 10, we discussed how to improve the performance based on the order in which you're placing values in your if statement. In tip numbers 11, 12, 13, they're all the same. All you need to do is embed your if statements in your aggregations, in your table calculations, in your LODs, not deciding to nest those statements, nesting your aggregations within an if statement. So first, put your aggregation inside of those, put your if statements. That's how they work. That's it for this episode. Thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one, just around the corner next week.